Welcome to E Squared Emporium for all things AP Psychology. Today we will be looking at IQ and Intelligence, Module 2.8. We're going to look at the formal theories of intelligence. What is IQ? IQ means intelligence quotient. There's also EQ, we'll look at in the emotions chapter, emotional quotient, but for today it's intelligence quotient, IQ. So we have two split theories. We have the G factor theory, which says there's a single form of intelligence. It's general intelligence. That's what the G in G factor stands for. And that underlies all mental abilities. So all typical IQ tests that you would receive today says that if you're smart in one area, you're probably smart in other areas too. Then we have multiple intelligences. We'll get more into this theory in a couple slides and also in class. This says that intelligence has lots of different types. It's not just math and language, and you can be high in one area and low in another area, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So Charles Spearman in the 1900s is the fellow who came up with G factor. And again, this generalized intelligence and that it flows into specific abilities. He describes it like a spring well of mental energy that flows into every action that intelligent people do, from working memory to fluid reasoning to knowledge, quantitative reasoning, and visual spatial processing. That's all caught up in the G factor. Howard Gardner is the gentleman who we credit with the multiple intelligence theory, and this can be controversial. Some people believe in it, some people don't believe in it. And they keep adding actually to his multiple intelligence theory. The people who believe it has merit have continued to increase different types of intelligences. So he believed that the conventional concept of intelligence was too narrow and too restrictive. Do you remember what we test for in elementary school? You were tested for math and you were tested for some kind of reading, verbal skills. That's what you were tested for. Those are the two main levels of intelligence, and we ignore everything else. Well, there's actually so many more schools. We're actually down to 9 different types of intelligence that he believes. So we will be taking the multiple intelligence test in class to see which are your top 3. Recently, they've added existentialism, which is like being life smart. You just think about life and death. You're a philosopher, theologist, you have really deep thoughts. But there's also a naturalist who's nature smart. So if you're really good at earth science, music smart, which could also be rhythm. That also goes with math. Music and math go together. There's logic and math, logic smart. There's verbal linguistic word smart. There's interpersonal, you're good at other people, you're people smart. There's body kinesthetic smart, you're body smart, you're good at sports. There's visual spatial types of intelligence. Picture smart can also be 3D, like engineering and architecture. And then, like I said, the existential. And the last one is intrapersonal. You are smart about yourself. You understand yourself. You understand your own feelings. You're kind of really good at taking stock of where you're at. So Cattell came up with 2 clusters of mental abilities, and we'll talk about this in developmental psychology too. Crystallized intelligence tends to be what we have more of when we get older. When we are senior citizens, we have crystallized intelligence. So think of it kind of hardening and crystallizing. This is reasoning and verbal skills that you learned back in school, the cold, hard facts. They've hardened like crystal. This increases with time. That's why your grandparents, they can tell you all kinds of stories. Just ask them. They'll tell you, they remember every date from history. They can tell you all kinds of facts. Those facts don't go away. That is crystallized intelligence. But what we're missing when we get older, we're missing fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is what young people have more of. It is spatial abilities, it is memory, things that come natural to you. This does tend to decrease over time. Fluid intelligence makes you able to pick up new technology faster. You don't need a Go phone because you've got fluid intelligence. You can handle picking up any kind of technology, and you're going to be always on the cutting edge of technology when you have fluid intelligence. So let's talk about the very first IQ or intelligence test. Alfred Binet, French psychologist in the 1880s, he designed this test to try to improve French education for the French bébés. And he partnered with Louis Terman, and together they developed the Stanford Binet IQ test, which is the one that we still tend to see today. It's gone through a lot of changes, though, I will say, than what it was in the 1880s. So the first IQ test basically used a formula, and we still use this formula today. So this is where the traditional value of what is your IQ score, when we say somebody has a 130 IQ or a 100 IQ, this is where we get it from. This is where we mean that it all came from this formula. So it's the mental age, which is the tested age compared to others of that age, over the chronological age, which is your actual age. So if they tested you, typically it's third grade that they test. So you're 8, you're 9. And then how are you compared with other people of that age, right? So how do you compare with other 8 or 9-year-olds? Well, maybe you're smarter than the average bear. So it's mental age over chronological age times 100. That's the IQ formula. And here's an example of IQ tests. Maybe, like I said, maybe you took this in second, third, fourth grade. That's typically when we start looking for a gifted and talented program. And they give you all kinds of strange things. And some of them you don't even have to be able to speak the language. We have tests where you can speak a different language and still take the IQ test. And there's absolutely no English language that's required. So this is again a standard deviation bell curve, which we've looked at before in Unit 0. And you see the first two bars, the center two bars, I should say, the 68% in the center. That's how many people score within 15 points of the average IQ, which is 100. So that's 15 points above, that's plus 1 standard deviation. And that's 15 points below, that's minus 1 standard deviation. So that's where the average population sits in their IQ. About 95% of all people will fall within 30 points of that 100. So again, the standard deviation for IQ is always 15. So this is what we use today for educational services, for diagnostic testing. If you have learning disabilities or gifted and talented, this is the same chart that we look at. So a high IQ is typically above 135. It depends on the state and sometimes the county. It can vary from county to county, but that's generally 2 to 2.5 standard deviations above the average. And we say that somebody is intellectually disadvantaged when they're below 70. So that would be a -2 standard deviation at that point. So Marilyn Vos Savant, where we get the term savant, she was the world's smartest woman. I say was because I believe other people have surpassed her. She had an IQ of 228. So she was in the Guinness Book of World Records with the highest IQ. Now, this little girl here, she's 11. She's from Mexico. She has a higher IQ than Einstein, and she's receiving her master's degree. She's 11, and she's getting her master's degree. But there are many, many other people who have shown up at a level 200 IQ. And some of the smartest people, when we think of Bill Gates or Elon Musk, some of those people are not in the 200s. So they're typically 145 or higher. But it's really a matter of what is your IQ, but also what do you do with it? Because a savant is actually the term we have today for somebody who's extremely highly gifted in intelligence, but maybe they're lacking social skills. Maybe they're terrified of leaving their house. Maybe they're a hoarder. Maybe they have other things that are going on. So we often see with extremely high IQ also comes other things. We call that twice blessed, right? When you get something else going on that's kind of holding you back. So not everybody gets to use their IQ. Marilyn Savant, she wasn't curing cancer. She wasn't going to another planet. She was actually writing crossword puzzles the last time I checked on her bio. So she's not necessarily, changing the world with an IQ of 228. She's just living her life with her IQ of 228. So psychometrics is this entire field of psychological and educational testing. So creating the test, giving the test, that's all psychometrics. psychopsychology, metrics meaning data. And standardization is what we mean when everyone takes the same test. Standardized tests are given consistent directions, consistent procedures, consistent environment. They're graded the same. Typically now they're graded by computer. That's when you have your bubble sheets. So we have the ACT, the SAT, and all of your AP exams. So they establish a normal distribution. It's very easy to say you're in the top 8th percentile, you're in the top 20th percentile. And standard deviation is always used to compare scores on a standardized test. And standard deviation will show how much of the scores vary from the average or from the mean. So you take the average of what it is in the county, in the nation, in the state, and are you above that? That's the standard deviation above the mean. We want our test to be both reliable and valid. Here are two terms that we remember from Unit 0 research. So reliable meaning if I gave the same test over and over and over and over, the results should be consistent within, a couple points of each other. There's two different types of reliability that we have to know. A split half reliability is where you're comparing two halves of the test. So maybe you're comparing the first half of the test to the second half of the test. That's usually the easiest way it's done. And a test retest reliability is where you use the same test on two different occasions. So if you are given test corrections in your class, or if you're given an MLO opportunity where you can go back and retake a test, that would be a test retest situation where it's the same test, but now you're going to take it again. And the test retest reliability should show that that test was reliable. Now, tests should also be valid. Is the test accurate? Does the test measure what you intended it to measure? So there's construct validity, which is it measuring what I want it to measure? Is an IQ test actually measuring IQ? Or is that IQ test actually measuring emotional quotient? Or is it measuring maturity? Or is it measuring social interaction? Or is it actually measuring what I want it to be measuring? And predictive validity means, can this test accurately predict a trait, such as high math scores often predict someone who would be good at engineering? And is that always true? And can a test score that you take in ninth grade be predictive of something you might choose to do in college or for a career? So that's what we mean by predictive validity. And again, here's the chart that we had used before to show the target and then missing the target. So we want our test to be reliable and valid, hitting the target and hitting the target consistently every time. There are many types of tests. There are aptitude tests and achievement tests, and you take both within any given school year. So an aptitude test predicts your abilities to learn a new skill. So for instance, if we gave you a career test, do you have the aptitude for this career? If you want to go into space, you have to take a lot of aptitude tests to see if you could handle being in space for that long, and could you handle being weightless and so forth. The SAT is an example of aptitude. The ASVAB is an example of aptitude. Achievement tests are tests to see what you know. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn? So the AP test at the end of the year, unit tests, class tests, teacher-made tests, midterms, final exams, those kinds of things. Those are achievement tests. What do we remember about IQ testing and genetics and nature and nurture? Because we already studied this as well. Well, we know that identical twins have very similar IQ points, even when they were separated into different homes. We know that adopted kids were more similar to their biological parents in terms of IQ. So that's on the genetic side, on the nature side. On the nurture side, we also know that early neglect leads to our IQ being lower. We saw that poverty and low socioeconomic situations, environments can lead to a lower IQ. We see that good schooling actually boosts us up to a higher IQ. And we see that when children are put into a higher socioeconomic family, their IQ does bounce up as much as one standard deviation. So we also know that personal and sociocultural biases can impact how we interpret the results. And we know again that poverty and education inequalities can have a negative impact on our IQ scores. Now let's look at the dark side of IQ testing. Eugenics, as we've already talked about, is the study of how to improve the gene pool and basically using human beings like livestock in a breeding program for reproducing only the smartest. And they used IQ tests, which was kind of dangerous and did hurt a lot of people. A lot of multi ethnic groups got very hurt by using IQ tests to prove, which was pseudoscience, you could not prove anything from this. But they would use the results and they would say, look, this group of people should breed and should continue to reproduce, and this group of people should not, and they should be sterilized. So IQ testing has been used for some kind of dangerous, sketchy purposes in the past. Also, we need to make sure we have a cultural fair test. Your IQ test has to be fair. These tests were used in the past to limit your access to education, to getting into college. I mean, you had to have an SAT score in the past in order to get into college. And so this could definitely hurt your SAT score if the test wasn't fair based on culture. It's been used to not allow people into the country for immigration. It's been used to keep people out of the military or out of certain jobs. So we need to have tests that could have no language skills, right? You don't have to speak English. It could be pictures. It could be any other nonverbal skills that can show us your IQ. And we want to minimize cultural specific questions, questions that only your culture or only that culture could answer. So the early tests we know were biased. They were written for white European oriented children. They were written for boys. They were not written for girls. Remember, girls rarely went past the 8th grade. Girls were not expected to go to college. They were not inclusive for all. They left out African American, Native American. They left out most immigrant populations. They left out Mexican American children. And also they left out children who were in poverty, because children in poverty did not have access to the vocab. They didn't have access to the textbooks. And so they would also score poorly. So here's an example. IQ test writers must be careful that there's no cultural, racial, socioeconomic bias in their test questions. Do you know what a Davenport is? You might know what an apple is, but have you been to an apple orchard? Would a child in poverty know what porcelain was? Would you know what high tea was? Would you know what a subway was if you didn't live in a city, if you were in the middle of the country? And would you know what a porte cochere was? You might not know these terms if you weren't raised on certain sides of the United States. You might not know what these terms were. So they have to be very, very careful how they write the questions. So stereotypes are also a part of our study of IQ. We have stereotype threat, which is where you feel at risk of conforming to that negative stereotype about your group. And it can influence your behavior. It can influence your cognitions, which is your thinking, and also your memory. So, an example, if you are an Asian male and your whole life you were told that Asian males are supposed to be good at science and math, and you're not. Maybe you like English better and you're just not great at math and science and your scores aren't great, right? You could have that stereotype threat where, in this case, you're actually at risk of hurting the stereotype. And that was kind of more of a positive stereotype. But if you think of what groups might have a negative stereotype, and then what if you goof up, right? Or what if you don't do so well? Then maybe you are conforming to that exact negative stereotype about your group. Stereotype lift is where you actually do better on a test when you compare yourself to other groups who do have the negative stereotype. So you're like, yeah, I got a C, but at least I didn't get what that person got, right? So you somehow feel better about yourself because you're comparing yourself to groups that have that negative stereotype. And that's again where IQ can be hurtful. The Flynn effect says that our IQ has been steadily rising for the past 80 years. There has been a 13.8 increase in IQ scores between 1932 and 1978. Now we have to remember, back in 1932, a lot of people did not go to school, they did not have formal education, or they did not go beyond the 8th grade. In 1978, barely 30% of the graduating class would be thinking about going on to college. So education standards have gone up, healthcare standards and food and the ability to go to school beyond the 8th grade. So that's 3 points per decade that it has been going up. So you can see on this chart from the baby boomers to Generation X to Generation Y to Generation Z to Generation Alpha. But we're starting to see a plateau, maybe not a reversal, but a plateauing. And so we're going to have to see what happens here with AI. As we use AI more and more and more, is it going to plateau our IQ scores or maybe even drop our IQ scores? We're going to have to see what happens with that. So we're going to take a growth mindset quiz in class. It is important to fix our mindset and figure out what mindset we have in the first place. So a fixed mindset is the belief that intelligence is fixed from birth. So fixed says it's fixed from birth. So what this means is you're either born intelligent or you're not. And it leads to less effort. So you're like, well, math either comes good to you or, math either comes easy to you or math doesn't come easy to you. That's a fixed mindset. And I've seen this even in highly, highly gifted students where things were easy for you in elementary school. They were easy for you in middle school. You were cruising until you got to harder classes in high school. And now you just kind of give up because it's always been easy for you. And you didn't even realize you had a fixed mindset because it's always been easy for you. And now you're going to have to actually struggle and you're going to have to actually give it some effort. And sometimes kids who were labeled as gifted and talented when they were younger, sometimes they don't want to do that. So a growth mindset is the belief that you can develop abilities through work and determination. It's the yes, you can kind of thing. And this leads to more effort. So sometimes there's a student who gets a B in a class, but they have a growth mindset and they're willing to do everything they positively can do, right? They're going to take every extra credit opportunity. They're going to take every challenge. They're going to push themselves as hard as they can because they have a growth mindset. And they're going to actually go further than the person who might have been really super intelligent and had a really high IQ and A's came to them easily, but now they have a fixed mindset and now they don't know how to really work for it. And now it's gotten a little tough. All right, so that's the difference in mindset. Now, creativity is the ability to produce or develop original work. We talked about divergent thinkers and brainstorming in our last section. So, a creative individual is going to display originality, imagination, expressiveness, what we call flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came up with the term flow, which we'll talk about in another chapter. And often we see very, very creative people have a high IQ. We often see that those go together. And we talked about which part of the brain creativity is often in the right hemisphere, not always, but we often see it in the right hemisphere and we often see it in left-handed people. So we won't go into detail here, but you might have this change during your lifetime. They're starting to see that video games could become the new IQ test because video games can actually show us a lot about the person's logic, problem solving, critical thinking. So certain video games, not all video games, but it could be that someday you play a video game to show your IQ score. And if you're interested in testing your own IQ, there are Mensa tests and Mensa groups online that you can find. And there's a lot of online IQ tests that you can find that you can take. And then you can test your own IQ and see how you feel.